It's my pleasure to welcome you back here to the Research Ethics Lecture Series hosted by the Rock Ethics Institute. I'd like to offer thanks to my colleague Nikolai Morar for helping organize the series, as well as our staff, Rob Peeler, Deborah Chorlanis, and Carola Embrook, for their help in organizing the series. I'd also like to offer a big thanks to Doug and Julie Rock for their ongoing support of the work we do here at the Rock Ethics Institute. Tonight's talk will last 45 to 50 minutes, and there'll be plenty of time for questions and answers at the end, so we hope you'll engage thoughtfully with our speaker. It's my pleasure to introduce Kate Spector-Baghdadi, the Associate Director of the Presidential Commission for the Study of Bioethical Issues. Kate received her JD and her M. Bioethics from the University of Pennsylvania Law School and the School of Medicine, respectively, after graduating from Middlebury College. Kate joined the Commission in 2010 and focused on reproductive justice, genetic testing, drug and device regulation, and teaching research ethics. As part of that work, she supervised staff work and acted as lead staff investigator for several Commission reports, including the 2011 Ethically Impossible report on the Guatemala STD research of the mid-1940s. Nikolai and I had the pleasure of hearing her speak on this topic as a keynote speaker of the 2012 Federal Office of Research Integrity Conference at Georgetown University, one of several lecture invitations she's received. It's our great pleasure to welcome her here to University Park as part of our Research Ethics Lecture Series to share with us her work on the Commission related to the fascinating and harrowing story of the Guatemala STD studies. Please join me in welcoming Kate Spector-Baghdadi.
What great and diverse work you guys are doing. It's really nice to see an institute that incorporates not just bioethics, but environmental ethics and all different types of ethics in the same institute. So that's really wonderful. Today, I'm here, though, to talk with you a little bit about the Guatemala STD experiments and the President's Bioethics Commission and their work sort of uncovering an historical and ethical analysis of these experiments. So I want to give you a little bit of background about what the Bioethics Commission is. So many U.S. presidents have had bioethics commissions since I believe Nixon was the first, and have had their own bioethics commissions, unlike in some other countries where there's a standing bioethics commission. The U.S. bioethics commissions have generally been appointed by executive order through the president. President Obama created his Bioethics Commission in November 2009 to advise him specifically on bioethical issues that might emerge as a consequence of advances in biomedicine and other related areas of science and technology. And the Commission really focuses its work on potential impacts of advances in research, healthcare delivery, and different areas of science and technology. So this is the current Bioethics Commission. As you can see, our commissioners come from a diversity of backgrounds and current careers. Our current chair is Dr. Amy Gutman, who's the current president of the University of Pennsylvania. And our vice chair is Jim Wagner, who is the president of Emory University. We also have many other academics and government officials who are part of our commission. For example, Christine Grady is the current head of the bioethics department at the National Institutes of Health. The Commission has put out 6 reports thus far, starting with a report on synthetic biology, the ethics of synthetic biology. Other reports include ethics of whole genome sequencing and privacy issues, a report on medical countermeasure research and researching medical countermeasures in a pediatric population, and most recently a report on the ethical management of incidental and secondary findings. And currently, the Commission is looking into neuroscience and ethics as part of the President's BRAIN Initiative. What I'm going to talk to you about today is the Commission's Ethically Impossible report, which looks into the research that was done in Guatemala in the 1940s. So as just a little bit of background about how the Commission came to look into these studies. So Professor Susan Reverby of Wellesley University actually came across the Cutler documents in June of 2003 when she was doing research for a book she was writing on the Tuskegee syphilis experiments. And Dr. Cutler, who was one of the principal investigators on the ground in Guatemala, was actually also associated with the Tuskegee experiments, yet no one had visited the 22 boxes of documents that he had donated to the University of Pittsburgh back in the 1990s. So Dr. Reverby went back later to do more research after she was done with her Tuskegee book, and then presented her findings on the Guatemala research in May of 2010. And she also contacted the CDC, who did their own investigation into the Guatemala research, came to the conclusion that further investigation was warranted. But it was enough information that it really spurred people to look into and take seriously these experiments. So what I have up here now is a list of the types of documents that were found in these 22 boxes that Cutler, after retiring from the University of Pittsburgh, where he was a professor of public health, he donated them in 1990. And all of the boxes, interestingly, only pertained to the Guatemala experiments. They didn't include any other information. So why Cutler donated these documents is kind of a mystery. We don't actually know. Although, if I were to personally speculate, I think it probably had something to do with the experiments had never been published. And Dr. Cutler was interested in people, I believe, appreciating the value of the experiments, of the Guatemala experiments. And but, of course, we'll never really know for sure why he donated these documents, but we wouldn't have learned about them probably if he hadn't. So this is an overview of the different types of documents that were donated. I think some of the most important documents from an ethical analysis perspective were the correspondence. And the correspondence allowed us as a commissioner some insight into what the researchers were thinking as they wrote back and forth with their supervisors. And it also allowed us some insight into the high level of supervision. So Dr. Cutler was a fairly junior researcher who was heavily supervised by government officials back at the Public Health Service. And it shows us the engagement, not just of Dr. Cutler, but his engagement with the U.S. government at the time. Another type of document that we found were experimental notebooks. So this included both clinical and laboratory notebooks spanning dozens and dozens of experiments across 5 different populations and several years, all ordered loosely chronologically and handwritten in English and Spanish here and there in his notebooks. Another type of document were subject note cards. There we found 9,000 individual subject note cards, which had different levels of medical histories written on them, as well as almost 600 photographs of the experiments and also portraits of some of the subjects in the experiments taken by Dr. Cutler's wife, who was down traveling with them, Mrs. Elise Cutler. And we speculate from the fact that the researchers admitted that they had a hard time telling the subjects apart, that actually one of the reasons that they took photographs was to try to identify their own research subjects. And then the final reports, which actually interestingly were written retrospectively by Dr. Cutler in the 1950s, and perhaps because the work was never published, this is why he sort of wrote his own reports and then donated them to the University of Pittsburgh. And it's really interesting to have these reports that were written 10 years or more later, because we find that his final reports seem to have written with a certain idealistic bent that perhaps the data doesn't support. So this is the publication that Susan Reverby came out that sort of spurred everybody to look in further into these experiments and also inspired the governmental apologies. The Secretary of State and Health and Human Services released a joint press release calling the studies reprehensible, and President Barack Obama called the then president of Guatemala, Alvaro Colom, and personally apologized for the clearly unethical studies, and also asked his bioethics commission to, quote, oversee a thorough fact-finding investigation into the specifics of the Public Health Service STD inoculation study, which we started in November 2010. So I wanted to give you a quick overview of the research design before I start talking about some of its scientific and ethical flaws, so you get sort of an idea of what at least the goal was. So during World War II, sexually transmitted diseases had been a major problem for the U.S. Armed Services. STD doctors at the time hypothesized that there is 350,000 new gonorrhea infections each year just in the Armed Services alone, accounting for over 7 million lost man days. So back then, during World War II, they hadn't yet discovered that penicillin cured many infectious diseases and STDs, which cost the U.S. Armed Services about $440 million a year in today's dollars. So as I had mentioned, Public Health Service researchers had discovered in 1943 that penicillin could cure syphilis, and suddenly you had all of these men who had devoted their entire lives in the Public Health Service to being syphilologists and looking for the cure for syphilis, and suddenly it was cured. And then everybody had to decide what the next frontier was, and they decided that the next frontier should be prevention. And this is a quote from one of the retrospective reports where Dr. Cutler writes, quote, "It was felt that carefully controlled studies on a relatively small group of individuals exposed to a high risk of infection were required before the preparation, meaning the prophylaxis they were testing, could be proposed for widespread use, particularly in the armed services." And I read that aloud to emphasize that the goal and the motivation of these experiments were not to help the subjects of the experiments. They were to aid the U.S. war effort. Dr. Cutler, who was the primary investigator, worked for Dr. Mahoney, who was the researcher who had discovered that penicillin could cure syphilis. And the primary goal for these experiments were to test a post-exposure prophylaxis, which means that after you're exposed to a virus, it would be something that you could do to prevent getting the virus yourself. So it's a type of wash you could use. By contrast, a pre-exposure STD prophylaxis would be something like a condom. And they're also interested in further refining proper dosages of penicillin and learning more about syphilis generally. So they talk a lot about reinfection and superinfection. Reinfection meaning that they didn't know if you had gotten syphilis once, whether you could ever get syphilis again, and that was an open question. And or superinfection meaning if you had one strain of syphilis, could you get another strain of syphilis and have two different strains of syphilis at the same time? So there are lots of open questions that we sort of take for granted now. But the type of experiments that you might be familiar with are most likely the intentional exposure experiments, which occurred for 2 years from 1947 to 1948. The populations involved in these experiments included commercial sex workers, prisoners, psychiatric patients, and soldiers, many of whom are who we categorize today under current human subjects research regulations as vulnerable populations. They're exposed to 3 different types of STDs, including gonorrhea, syphilis, and chancroid, some only one, some all 3. And whereas originally the proposed protocol was that researchers were going to go down and use commercial sex workers as potential vectors for disease and sort of observe sex workers in a prison and use a prophylaxis in a prison. Once they realized that they weren't reliably transmitting STDs at all, it was hard to test their post-exposure prophylaxis. So actually they moved on to other more invasive methods, including skin contact, injecting syphilis emulsion, scarification and abrasion, where they would actually abrade people's skin and genitalia and then rub emulsion into them, and cisternal punctures, where they would actually take emulsion and inject it into the back of people's skulls, potentially in hopes of speeding neurosyphilis, which in a natural state would take decades to advance to, but they wanted to test on it immediately, and so they tried to cause neurosyphilis themselves. And really, the main takeaway point of this is that these were incredibly invasive and painful procedures. And also, I want to draw the connection that the less autonomy that these subjects were perceived to have. So, for example, the psychiatric patients, the more invasive the methods that the researchers used on them. So there's a lot about the prisoners objecting to different kinds of experiments, and so they mostly just had the sex worker experiments and some injection experiments, whereas the really much more invasive and painful things were reserved for the psychiatric patients. So this was not just American researchers and American funding. This was also supported in Guatemala by many of the directors of the institutes where it was conducted, including the director of the Ministry of Public Health, the National Orphanage, the director of medical services at the penitentiary, the psychiatric hospital, and the Army Medical Department. Also, Dr. Juan Funes, who was the chief of the venereal disease section at the Ministry of Public Health, Dr. Cutler credits Dr. Funes for having the idea of doing the experiments in Guatemala, because Dr. Funes actually went up to the Venereal Disease Research Laboratory for a fellowship. And around the time when they started talking about having to do these pre-exposure, post-exposure prophylactic experiments, and Dr. Cutler credits him with coming up for the idea of saying, well, hey, we have commercial sex workers who work in our prisons legally. Maybe you could come down and do controlled experiments in Guatemala. Another thing that was occurring at the time was after World War II, NIH for the first time set up currently their dual peer review structure, which consists of a specialized study section generally made up of experts in a very specific field, as well as a national advisory council, which would review the work and the recommendations from the syphilis study section, and then was eventually signed off on by the Surgeon General, who was then Thomas Perrin. And Dr. Cassius Van Slyke, who was the new director of this division of research grants, sort of spurred on this new generation of researchers, which he wrote exemplified, and I quote, "the complete acceptance of a basic tenet of the philosophy upon which the scientific method rests, the integrity, independence of the research worker, and his freedom from control, direction, regimentation, and outside interference." So the syphilis study section are the experts who reviewed the experiments, and actually they were the first study section to be created under this new system, under this new dual review system. And at their very first meeting, they reviewed the Guatemala research and recommended it for approval. However, one of the challenges of specialized review is that often the people who are involved in such specialized review know each other, they've worked together in the past, they hope to work together in the future. And as an example, Dr. John Mahoney, who was on the syphilis study section, was listed as the principal investigator of the grant under review. He was the director of the laboratory where all the staff came from. The product under investigation was a continuation of his work. He acted as a supervisor for the researchers in Guatemala. And there's no evidence indicating whether or not he recused himself from review of the grant. But certainly even if he did, everyone would have known that it was his own work, which is a problem in and of itself. Also, Dr. John Heller, who was on the syphilis study section, had just come from working with Dr. Mahoney at the Venereal Disease Research Laboratory. And he was the one who actually asked Dr. Cutler to take those 600 photographs of what they were doing in Guatemala so he could use them for his teaching back in the United States. And at the time he was approving the Guatemala STD experiments, he was also conducting his own experiments in Tuskegee, experiments where you probably have already heard of. So one thing that the commission really focused on were the people involved as subjects in the Guatemala experiments and what happened to them. So this is an overview, a table of the empirical research that we conducted, sort of, because what we felt was very important was sort of counting how many people had actually been involved and counting what had happened to them. So we found that 5,540 people had been involved in the experiments overall. But remember that the experiments also included diagnostic experiments and also experiments on proper dosages of penicillin. So the number 1308, so there were 1,308 subjects who were involved in the intentional exposure STD experiments. And of those 1,300 subjects, about 700 then later received some treatment for the STDs that they've been exposed to. And I use the word exposed and treatment as opposed to infected and cured because unfortunately the data were so sporadic and there were so many flaws in the data that we couldn't firmly establish who had actually been infected because as you remember, they were concurrently conducting experiments to figure out the best type of diagnostic test. At the same time, they were also trying to conduct post-exposure prophylactic experiments to make sure that their method worked, and then conducting those diagnostic tests to see whether it worked or not. So obviously, there's some inherent flaws in that. And with the treatment, we just didn't have enough data. We had so much missing data that we just couldn't firmly establish whether people had received the entire regimen of penicillin. So a little more information about people involved in the experiments. I did want to highlight that there were actually 18 subjects involved in the experiments in that 1,300 number who were under the age of 18. There were 2 soldiers. A sex worker that was involved was only 16 years old. A prisoner was aged 15, and there were 14 psychiatric patients from the ages of 14 to 17. And to just give you a little taste of the documents that we were working with, that's just a screenshot of 2 different parts of the same document, but this is a page from one of Dr. Cutler's clinical notebooks. And you see it says across the top, patients for gonorrhea experiment in the Guardia de Honor and the Honor Guard at the Guatemalan Army, and then the name, and then the age, which is 10 años, and the rank. And that 10-year-old actually was involved in 3 different experiments with a sex worker, and then also was infected with gonorrhea by hand, where they took infected gonorrheal pus from one of the subjects and then inserted it into his penis to then see whether the post-exposure prophylactic method had worked. So obviously there's a lot of issues with research integrity in these experiments. So I just wanted to go through a little bit with you and try to parse some of them out because granted, we can all sit back and say, well, clearly these were horrible, they were unethical, they were unscientific, but I think it's really important to fully understand why and all the sort of different reasons and all the sort of different things that were going on in these experiments to really learn from them. One thing that I think was one of the most important findings that the commission made was that they were not just applying retrospective moral judgment. This was something that the researchers actually knew at the time was unethical. And an excellent example of this is, Dr. Harry Eagle, who was of the Public Health Service and was actually also on the syphilis study section that approved the Guatemala research, published research. So his research was about using penicillin as a pre-exposure prophylactic. So saying if everybody took a low dose of penicillin every day of their life, then they would be less likely to acquire an STD. So he did his experiment in rabbits. And then Waldemar Kempfort, who was a science editor of the New York Times in 1947, did a little write-up of his experiment, just like the New York Times often does now. And he writes, "The case holds good for rabbits, but no tests of human beings have yet been made. To settle the human issue quickly, it would be necessary to shoot living syphilis germs into human bodies. Since this is ethically impossible," which is where the commission got its quote, "it may take years to gather the information needed." So not only did the researchers down in Guatemala actually start injecting human beings with living syphilis germs just months after in Guatemala, but we can prove through the correspondence that we have that Dr. Cutler actually read this article in the New York Times and then wrote to his supervisor, Dr. John Mahoney, who was on the syphilis study section, to bring it to his attention. And this letter reads in part that the article in the New York Times, quote, "went on to speculate on the method of proving Eagle's hypothesis in humans and said that such work could not ethically be carried out. Then in JAMA appeared a notice about the grant to the Pan American Sanitary Bureau, which is how they had gotten their funding from NIH to the Pan American Sanitary Bureau, to the researchers from the Venereal Disease Research Laboratory for the study of syphilis. It is becoming just as clear to us as it appears to be to you that it would not be advisable to have too many people concerned with this work in order to keep down the talk. We are just a little bit concerned about having anything said about our program that would adversely affect its continuation. So not only do I think that this is very telling for many reasons, but actually, ironically, several weeks later, there's a letter about Dr. Harry Eagle, who was on the syphilis studies section, and after this article came out about his own work, writing down to the researchers in Guatemala and asking if he could use some of their subjects to conduct his own experiments in humans. Another letter which has gotten a lot of attention is this one from February 1947, which is about the then Surgeon General, Dr. Thomas Perrin. And this is a letter from Dr. Coatney, who was another malariologist at the Public Health Service, saying that he had just been talking to Dr. Perrin and, quote, "As you well know, he is very much interested in the project, and a merry twinkle came into his eye when he said, you know, we couldn't do such an experiment in this country." So to be fair, this is what lawyers call hearsay, and it makes us uncomfortable. But certainly it gives you pause and makes you also wonder exactly what Dr. Perrin, if he did indeed say this, was referring to. So the timing where this landed in the experiments was that the researchers down in Guatemala had just started the sex worker experiments, which was the first type of experiments before they sort of degraded into these more invasive methods. So it's potentially that Dr. Perrin was referring to that we couldn't do sex work experiments in the United States because sex work was at the time illegal. There are other more nefarious interpretations of this quote, but that's definitely one possibility. So another thing that I want to look in with you is the obfuscation of data, and those of you who are science or medical students might recognize some of these sins of research. So this here is a page from one of Dr. Cutler's contemporaneous clinical notebooks. And as I mentioned, that the researchers, when they began their experiments, had a really hard time transmitting STDs via the sex workers. So they would sometimes conduct experiments with a control and an active arm, with the active arm trying to test the prophylactic, but the control arm, no one would have gotten any STDs. So you couldn't prove anything with the active arm if there was no baseline of infection in the control arm. So this is the first experiment in the contemporaneous clinical notebooks that they were taking. And as you can see, it was performed on May 10th, 1947. And it involved prisoners and sex workers to determine the normal rate of infection. However, this is a page from Dr. Cutler's final syphilis report, which he wrote in 1955. And if you note, the date of the first experiment that he reported was actually May 13th. And it was because he couldn't establish a base rate on May 10th, and so he just completely eradicated that data point. Another interesting example, and I think it's particularly interesting in its insight into sort of human demeanor, is actually Dr. Cutler left a draft of his chancroid experiment final report in the boxes that he donated to the University of Pittsburgh. And in the draft of this chancroid report, we can see that so what's crossed out there, I know it's kind of a mess, but it's the researchers' full names. So it says Dr. Carlos Tejada, who was one of the Guatemalan researchers that they were working with, and Dr. Sasha Levitin, who was another one of the Public Health Service researchers. And this is talking about how they were intentionally exposing these subjects. And then Dr. Cutler then goes and crosses out their names with pencil and writes the doctors above it. And then he also left his final report in that box. And in the final report, it just says the doctors. And it also doesn't even mention that they were conducted in Guatemala. It says in the country in which the study was conducted. So that's pretty interesting that you would even bother to redact information in that way and then put the redacted draft and the final draft in the same box. But we might never know the motivation behind that. Another thing that I wanted to look into is the falsification of data. So this is another page from one of Dr. Cutler's contemporaneous clinical notebooks. And as you can see, a lot of our information actually comes from comparing the correspondence in what these researchers were saying to each other, with what was actually happening on a daily level with the notebooks, and then how they described it retrospectively. So in this notebook, you can see that here they're testing their prophylaxis on a control and an active arm. In that first yellow square, we can see that the active subjects are receiving the prophylaxis are actually getting inoculated with gonorrhea with a swab carefully applied to the tip of the penis with great care not to enter deeply into the urethra, a method Cutler called superficial inoculation. However, by contrast, in the control arm, as we can see below in the second yellow square right there, the swab was inserted 1/2 inch into the urethra and carefully applied to the mucous membrane, a method Dr. Cutler called deep inoculation. So even that on its face is recognized as a problem for researchers, that he was infecting his control and his active in two different methods. However, moreover, we can establish that through previous experiments that Dr. Cutler had conducted, he actually knew that superficial inoculation only infected a base rate of 50% of subjects, whereas deep inoculation infected 98% of subjects. So of course, that's not an appropriate baseline to say, oh, actually our prophylaxis is really working well when you're using the less effective method of inoculation. And of course, one of the really most important things with these experiments was the lack of informed consent, and not only that, the active deceit on part of the researchers. One thing that certainly played a race was racism, not only in Guatemala in general, but actually towards the indigenous Guatemalan population, who predominantly made up the populations of the prison and of the Guatemalan army and of the psychiatric institution. And almost immediately upon arriving in Guatemala, Dr. Cutler, so there's a letter from Dr. Cutler to Dr. Arnold, who's one of his supervisors, and he's talking about another public health service researcher who's down there doing other types of work. And it reads that this other researcher had told them that, quote, "With the Indians in the prison, we may well do our work with little or no explanation, as they are only confused by explanations and knowing what is happening." So not only were they not receiving consent, but they're also saying, but it's okay because we would just confuse them. So we're really doing what's best for them. Unless you think that they definitely thought it was all right what they were doing, Dr. Arnold, who's the gentleman who received the last letter, writes back to Dr. Cutler and says, and I quote, "I'm a bit, in fact, more than a bit leery of the experiment with the insane people. They cannot give consent, do not know what's going on, and if some goody organization got wind of the work, they would raise a lot of smoke. Maybe I'm too conservative. A lot depends on the medical officer and the reaction of the supervisor. Also, how many knew what was going on. I realize that a patient or a dozen could be infected, develop the disease, and be cured before anything could be suspected. The penicillin could be a treatment for the insanity. In the report, I see no reason to say where the work was done and the type of volunteer." So, of course, this is exactly what we see Dr. Cutler then doing later when he writes up his final reports. So this is an incredibly interesting letter. One, it's the supervisor admitting that he is knowledgeable that these psychiatric patients cannot give informed consent. back in 1947. So lest you say, well, they didn't know back then. No, he knew. Second, that his main concern wasn't for the subjects, but it was for some goody organization getting wind of it. And third, suggesting not only not informed consent, but active deceit by exploiting completely what we now try to avoid as therapeutic misconception and actually saying, yes, this is exactly, that's what it is. It's a treatment for your insanity. His quote. And also, we know that the researchers, many of these researchers had been involved in similar experiments in Terre Haute, Indiana, in a federal penitentiary there, and they were conducting gonorrhea experiments, and they used many of the same methods. And actually, in that experiment, they had used this consent form, which is actually a pretty thorough consent form, even by today's standards. And there was lots of debate that went all the way up to the Surgeon General on the appropriate types of consent and whether these prisoners could appropriately give consent, and making sure these prisoners were well aware of the risks involved. So this was research that had just been conducted several years earlier by the same researchers in America, and obviously compare and contrast that to what happened down in Guatemala. So, of course, the commission's focus, being a bioethics commission, was on the ethical analysis in addition to just this fact-finding investigation. And the commission found that the researchers' ethical failings included faulty scientific design and failure to obtain consent, because, of course, we now recognize that ethical failings and failure to obtain consent also are included under faulty scientific design, above and beyond the fact that there is additional major problems with the data. And once again, that this just wasn't just retrospective moral judgment. That's something that I read a lot in the literature, cautioning about going back and applying our own current moral structures to what was happening at the time. No, we knew what they were thinking at the time, and we knew that many of them at least knew it was wrong. The commission did conclude, however, that the Guatemala experiments could not be approved under the current system for protecting human subjects in U.S.-funded research, but that these experiments serve as an important reminder that research ethics are not obstacles to be overcome or evaded, but are integral guideposts for the advancements of science. So that came out in 2011, and since then there's been some interesting developments in reactions to the Guatemala experiments, a couple of which I'd like to highlight here for you. One has been that the American Sexually Transmitted Disease Association actually for many years gave out the Thomas Perrin Award, who, as you may recall, was the Surgeon General who signed off on the Guatemala experiments, the gentleman with the alleged merry twinkle in his eye from the letter. And also, towards the end of the experiments, Dr. Mahoney wrote to Dr. Cutler when Thomas Perrin resigned as Surgeon General that they had, quote, lost a dear friend and it might be time to get their ducks in a line. But of course, these were all pretty circumstantial, and also all somebody said that somebody said this. But the American Sexually Transmitted Disease Association looked into renaming their award, and this is a quote from President Bradley Stoner from a press release at the time that reads, quote, "Some have argued that the Perrin Award name must be changed given that Dr. Perrin signed off on the research proposal and was well aware of the nature of the human inoculation studies to be undertaken in Guatemala. Others suggest that changing the name of the Perrin Award might not be the proper response and might lead us to forget the contributions of this influential figure in public health. The Guatemala studies may have occurred more than 60 years ago, but the chilling lessons are absolutely relevant today. Our discussion could not be more important." So the ASTDA actually decided to rename their Achievement Award. Actually, I think it's kind of interesting to note that in 1974, before the award was named, one of its recipients was Genevieve Stout, who was actually a serologist who worked in the Guatemala experiments and who stayed in Guatemala after the other researchers had left in 1948 until 1953, continuing to follow up on serology data and sending the results back to the Public Health Service. So she was the one who won the Perrin Award in 1947. And then the first winner after the award was renamed was actually Jonathan Zendelman of Hopkins, who acted as a consultant for the commission. So I think that's a really interesting, at least, bookend to at least his career and the name of that award. Also, it's worth noting that peer review of specialized experts still forms the basis of NIH's current dual review grant process. However, of course, as many of you know, infamous researcher scandals such as the Tuskegee syphilis experiments have led to modern scientific research participant regulations to protect subjects from just the kinds of atrocities committed in Guatemala. And there are myriad regulations, but they now include specialized conflict of interest requirements, as well as IRB approval, including lots of information about informed consent and minimization of risk. But the Bioethics Commission didn't want to just stop its work at telling the story and also saying that current regulations would have prevented this experiment. It really also wanted to devote time and effort and energy in making sure that under any circumstance, these types of things don't happen again, and also that current researchers understand why there are so many regulations, that these aren't just check boxes to check off. And as part of that, they created several different kinds of pedagogical materials that I just wanted to briefly go through with you because personally, obviously, I'm very interested in this kind of stuff, but I think that they can be really interesting resources for students looking to write papers. One of the things that the Commission released soon after its report is, so now if you go to the Commission's report, which is available at bioethics.gov, and you go to the footnotes, so this is a page where we quote something, and then if you go to the footnote and you click on the bait stamp in the footnote of the electronic version of the report, it will actually bring you to the original document. So you can read the letter or the report yourself. So one thing, hopefully there's more information that students can learn about and write about in the future, more ethical analysis that can be done. And also, just so you don't have to take our word for it, it's sort of as much transparency as we can give is saying, this is our statement and this is the documents that we use to back it up. Another piece that we released, which I personally find really interesting, is so the way we established all of the numbers of the subjects that had been involved was we created this massive million-cell spreadsheet where we input types of information, including subject name, subject sex, age, date of experiment, all of their STD testing, any clinical notes that appeared in the documents, basically any piece of data or information that we could tie back to one specific subject. So if it wasn't just generalized data, if it was any data that had to do with a specific person, we input it into this document and then conducted several data cleaning methods to really try to focus in on which subjects were the same, because sometimes they're recognized by numbers, sometimes they're recognized by name, sometimes initials, and trying to figure out which subjects were the same. And so we could get all of their information across these 12,000 pages in one place by sorting. And the Commission redacted these documents, redacted this data, and made it available. But one of the things that I think is particularly helpful is, whereas the Cutler documents are currently available through the National Archives and from the Commission's website, they're redacted with the sort of classic black box government redaction, which of course really prohibits sort of interrelational data analysis, because you can't tell who the same person is. You can't tell that this black box is the same as that black box. So what we were able to do with this data is we had the names and we renamed them commercial sex worker subject number 2, so that at least all of her data could be taken together so we could really read and look into the stories as a whole. Another interesting thing that you can do with this data, and this is all right online on bioethics.gov, is you can sort it, obviously, in different ways because it's an Excel spreadsheet. And this is all data from one subject. So you can see that, in May of 1947, she had gonorrhea applied to her cervix, and she was inoculated with pus from, and then we referred back to the soldier subject who they'd taken the pus from, who had the active infection for 5 days without treatment. And then we see that a month later, so she was testing negative for gonorrhea, and then a month later she's testing positive for gonorrhea, and she has sexual contact with 7 men between 8:34 and 9:35 p.m. Another way that you can look at the data which I think is also pretty interesting, is that you can sort by exposure method. Obviously, you can sort by anything that you want. But when I was talking about our conclusions that some of the more invasive methods were actually used in the most disenfranchised populations, you can see here that all 7 subjects who were exposed to syphilis by cisternal puncture were actually all in the psychiatric institution. And the last type of document that we released is actually an independent study guide, and this is probably more for educators. But what this is it's a casebook, really, from all based in the Guatemala data and information that we found. And it goes through modules such as vulnerable population, secrecy, informed consent, scientific integrity. And it includes all in one place sort of a brief summation of facts that students need to know about what happened, plus some excerpts from the primary source right in the document itself, as well as comment, analysis, and discussion questions and further recommended readings. So insofar as you're ever assigned to teach a quick bioethics research ethics seminar, we hope that this can be a really self-sufficient and self-contained resource. And both the study guide and the Ethically Impossible report are available on our website in Spanish and in English. So I really think that the conclusion to take away from this is, of course, there were many, some might say, immoral individuals involved in the Guatemala experiments. And there's no way that we as a society can ever prevent immoral individuals having positions of power in science and medicine. However, ethics education and fully understanding what happened, why it happened, why we have regulations, why they're important to follow, and what people should do in space where there is no regulations or there's an assessment about a difference between that which is ethical and that which is legal and what people should do. And that's still a critical component of building responsible investigators for the future. So that's my quick summary. Maybe you didn't think it was so quick, but I did. The quick summary of what happened in the Guatemala experiments and sort of some of the things that have come out since then to further elaborate and sort of specify the type of work the commission did, all of which is available. And at this point, I'd be happy to take any questions, talk about more in depth, anything that you're interested in, just hear comments. I'd love to hear what you guys think. Thank you.
So one of the things that I'm interested in and I'm learning is, spatial analytic methods. And I was actually wondering if in any of this data, the researchers identified the location of where these individuals lived and if there's been any attempt to look at the abuses maybe by geographic location and other spatial processes.
Sure. So one of the reasons that the investigators say that they targeted these specific populations was actually because they were geographically constrained in institutions. So they were all in Guatemala. The people in the STD research were all in Guatemala City, Guatemala, either in the penitentiary, in the psychiatric institution, sex workers working in the community, or at the army barracks. So they came from areas of Guatemala which populated by indigenous populations, but they themselves, during the time of the experiments, were just constrained in those locale.
Everyone seemingly had concerns about the experiment at the time it was taking place, but then the researchers didn't even really create a rigorously controlled scientific experiment. Why didn't they even feel the need, why didn't they try to justify it by using the scientific process just perfectly?
I think that's a really good question because I think that it still is one that's pertinent today. And I personally believe that the reason was because they just saw the scientific method as a constraint and a corner that could be cut. And they felt that their research was so important and that they had to go forward so fast because they only had the grant for a year and it was only extended for one additional year, that they really didn't have time to bother with the whole scientific method. And then there are other examples of some experiments getting started on the basis of data that hadn't yet been produced in previous experiments. So there was this sort of mad rush mentality that the researchers really took on. And once again, this is speculation, but I speculate that it's because of the limitations of the funding structure, because they only had several years to do their research, which of course is also really interesting because it's a constraint that we currently still operate under.
So I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about the some salient similarities and differences between the Guatemala experiments and the Tuskegee experiments. Particularly maybe in regard to, do you see like a similar logic behind the experiments? Obviously, it seems there's similar ethical problematics in the experiments, but do you also see similar failures in the scientific rigor of the experiments as well in Tuskegee as in Guatemala and things of that nature? I wonder if you just comment on that a little bit.
Yeah, I think there's some really important similarities and differences between Tuskegee and Guatemala. Some really interesting similarities are that it was many of the same researchers involved. Of course, they both involved syphilis. They both involved, to some extent, disenfranchised, vulnerable populations. But there are also some really important differences. The main one being that, of course, in Tuskegee, no one was intentionally exposed. They selected subjects on the basis of already having syphilis. And for those of you who don't know, although I'm sure most of you do, tried to observe the natural progression of syphilis without any medical intervention. And when the Tuskegee syphilis experiments were started, which was actually before the Guatemala experiments had started, the treatment at the time for syphilis was very toxic and actually could sometimes result in death and wasn't particularly effective. So that's one of the justifications that some people have argued for, at least at the beginning of the Tuskegee syphilis experiments, and saying, listen, gee, it wasn't that much worse than the treatment. But of course, that argument completely falls apart after 1943, when they realized that subjects could be given penicillin and recover fully from syphilis. And so I think that really ethically was a huge turning point from the Tuskegee syphilis experiments. I've also heard, in particular, Dr. Reverby will say, this isn't a contest of which was the most horrible. And I don't think certainly that it is. But there are some definite, very important differences. Although another similarity includes sort of active deceit, because one of the things that I know that they did in Tuskegee was they would tell the gentlemen involved that they were receiving treatment for their bad blood. As people who've read Jim Jones's book know. And then also not only were they not given penicillin for their syphilis, but they were sometimes actively prevented from receiving penicillin for other things. Like if they broke a bone and it broke the skin, their clinician would otherwise want to present them with penicillin to prevent infection. And actually some of the public health service researchers would try to get in between this clinician-patient relationship and be like, oh no, he's part of an experiment. You can't give him penicillin. But to your question about some of the flaws in the scientific method, obviously it was extremely hard to control all of these individuals over decades from ever receiving any type of penicillin for anything. And we know it's been established that many of them actually did receive penicillin. So even though it was just supposed to be an experiment that was an observational study of the natural progression, we know that that wasn't even accurate. And actually, sorry, one last interesting anecdote about the relationship between Tuskegee and Guatemala is Dr. Cutler obviously was involved in both. And in the 1990s, after the apology and the reparations for the men involved in Tuskegee, there was a Nova special that you guys can all Google either currently or later that Dr. Cutler spoke in, and he was interviewed, and it was about how awful the Tuskegee syphilis experiments had been. And Dr. Cutler says, the worst thing about the Tuskegee syphilis experiments is that they were ended. And they were, some of the most wonderful research I've been involved in, which I think is really telling, because that's right about the time, just right after is when he donated all of the Guatemala boxes to Pitt. So I think that tells us a lot about his state of mind and his psyche, and which is what leads me to believe that he donated these documents because he really thought that this was wonderful, valuable research that the world was missing out on.
Did anything useful, like, even come out of this at all? Like, did we actually take anything away from this? Like, did we try to? I don't know. I'm just worried about that.
No, I think that that's a really important question and one that I always get asked. And one of the answers is no, it was never published at the time. We're not entirely sure why it wasn't published. But Dr. Mahoney wrote to Dr. Cutler in 1948 that he shouldn't request to extend his grant because then he'd have to file an annual report. And he didn't feel like that was something that they should do at the time. So I speculate that the reason it wasn't ever published was because they realized the extent of the unethical methods that they used and didn't want that to become public knowledge. Some of the data from these experiments, I sort of call it whitewashed. We're sort of whitewashed into other articles. For example, there are some publications where Dr. Cutler cites an article for data that is not located in the article to which he cites, but actually we can establish came from the Guatemala experiments. There's other examples of Dr. Cutler citing to a conversation with Juan Funes in particular, which was allowed in some non-peer-reviewed publications, but then Dr. Cutler later went on to publish a lot about STD research, and then all he had to do was refer back to the non-peer-reviewed publication, which allowed him to cite to a conversation, and suddenly he was citing to an acceptable source. So I think that there was a little bit of sort of getting the Guatemala data in that way. I don't think that, so we were working with Jonathan Zentelman, who's an infectious disease expert at Hopkins, and to his knowledge, this data had not been used widely, and certainly wasn't rediscovered until now, but there are just so many flaws. I mean, above and beyond the debate of whether you can ever ethically use data that was obtained so unethically, we just don't even have enough information from the experiments to really establish, they were done so haphazardly. You really can't rely on the data. And so the commission is really careful to be clear that when it releases its own subject data spreadsheet, the intent of releasing that data is to further ethics education research, and the intent is not to further scientific research on the data, because we've taken the position that you really can't do good scientific research with the data.
I'm wondering if gender and sexism is another relevant lens of analysis in terms of what you saw in the documents. And I ask partially because of the involvement of sex workers. I'm assuming they were women. I could be wrong.
Yeah, they were women.
Okay. That was the assumption. And I'm wondering if there were differences in patterns of treatment in terms of exposure and general involvement in the research trials.
Yeah, I think the story of the sex workers that were involved was really one of the most compelling stories. And so there were actually many regulations about sex work in Guatemala in the 1940s, and one of them was that sex workers had to report twice a week to the venereal disease hospital there for STD testing. And if they were found to be positive for STDs, they were had some form of treatment, or were not allowed to offer their services. And so then the director of that STD clinic was Dr. Juan Funes, who was the one who had gotten the fellowship up with the Venereal Disease Research Laboratory with the Public Health Service. So what would then happen is when these women reported for their legally mandated STD testing services and they were found to be positive for these STDs, then Dr. Funes referred them over to Dr. Cutler to use with his subjects in the penitentiary. So he actually knew that they were infected with STDs. Almost immediately, Dr. Cutler, as I mentioned, felt like the rate of infection without prophylaxis was not high enough. So he would try to make women even more infected by putting pus inside their vaginas before they had intercourse with the prisoners, or by injecting syphilis into their cervixes, which of course is horrific. But I also think one of the most telling things is Dr. Cutler never saw these women as even subjects. They don't have their own clinical note cards. There's no notes on them. Once in a while he'll write, this is who he had sex with, this is how many times they had sex. But they didn't even rise to the level of the poor treatment that the subjects got. And then also, whereas there was at least some effort to treat at least half of the subjects who were involved in the experiments, there's no records of Dr. Cutler giving any of the sex workers penicillin. And our presumption, at least one of them, he said, oh, she received treatment. But we assumed that she was receiving treatment actually from the venereal disease hospital. And at that time, penicillin was a very limited commodity, and only the researchers down in Guatemala had it. So she wouldn't have been receiving penicillin at the hospital. She would have been receiving some sort of less effective salve. So yeah, I think that gender played a huge role. And also the presumption that the prisoners were a controlled subject population that weren't otherwise having sex, but with the sex workers that they were providing, which of course has, heteronormative assumptions based in it. But I think it's a really interesting perspective, yeah.
You spoke briefly about the Tuskegee study and how after that information came out to the public, it eventually led towards the development of the modern IRB system and the federal regulations that's used to ensure compliance. Now that we know what we know of what happened in Guatemala, how have they improved? Have they begun working towards their own federal regulations or their own research ethics committee?
Down in Guatemala?
Yes.
Oh, okay. So one of the things that happened down in Guatemala that the President's Bioethics Commission was involved in is they actually set up their own investigation committee that I was part of a delegation that traveled down and met with them, and it was headed by the then Vice President of Guatemala, as well as many preeminent scholars in the field, and they released their own report investigating the research that was conducted down in Guatemala, which was really interesting. It was in Spanish, but they came to many of the same conclusions. They had a lot more sort of historical, they knew more about obviously about the networks and the connection and many of the politics that were involved at the time in Guatemala. So I definitely highly recommend, insofar as you speak Spanish, reading their report, because it's I think we came to many of the same basic conclusions, but we were incredibly impressed by the detail and the breadth of their work.
Do you think the Guatemala experiments and Tuskegee as well might be included in U.S. history books? Because I had a conversation with my little sister. She's a junior in high school, and so they're learning about the Nuremberg trials, and it would be interesting for students to discuss this as well as the Nuremberg trials.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's a really interesting, broader question about, the pedagogy of research and clinical ethics in our society generally. Certainly, I would be a proponent of introducing these kinds of issues later. Many scholars have argued that by the time we introduce research ethics at the graduate level, sort of the hidden curriculum and the culture might be too strong already for students. And certainly, I think that these experiments are a really interesting example. So the commission specifically tailored its study guide for a college or graduate level, I think in part just because of how graphic the experiments are. But I think that, Jim Jones's book is a great example of a very sort of approachable and understandable way, Jim Jones's book, Bad Blood, that could be read in the high school level, that could really get these conversations started.
Kind of on a related note, would you qualify these as war crimes because they were occurring to further the war effort of the United States?
I don't think I probably know enough about the international and national definitions of war crimes to really give you a good answer for that. They were after the war after World War II had ended. Sorry that I don't have more information on that, but certainly, I mean, if that's the type of thing that you're interested in, there's lots of literature surrounding the doctor's trial at Nuremberg, and the ethical code that was presented there, and there's some really interesting scholarship into that type of thing, and that was obviously conducted during World War II.
I had another question. I was wondering if there were any individuals, maybe other secondary sources or sources close to Dr. Cutler, maybe, I don't know, maybe graduate students or junior personnel working on this that did have dissenting opinions or offered insight into sort of feelings of regret that overlap with the time that these were occurring.
Yeah, I think that that's really incredibly interesting, and I wish that I had more information on it for you. So unfortunately, when we were conducting our research, the only person who was really still alive at the time was Elise Cutler, Mrs. John Cutler, who had taken out all the photographs. And the commission did reach out to her, and her attorney wrote us back to say that she wasn't interested in speaking with us. But so I think your question comes from whether there were more junior people who might have sort of seen things differently. And I do think it's important to emphasize that Dr. Cutler himself was very junior. This was his first big assignment. He was brand new to the public health service. I think he was about 31. So he was pretty brand new, and his supervisors back in the U.S. were, much older, much more well-established. Dr. Mahoney and Dr. Arnold's discovery of penicillin curing syphilis, made the front page of the Times. Like, this was a big deal, and these were the people that he was looking up to and he was reporting to, who were sending him letters saying things like, oh, maybe you could do this. And actually Dr. Arnold in particular, so he had that one letter that said, there's no reason that we need to say in our final reports where this was conducted or who it was conducted with. And in fact, that's what Dr. Cutler did. But also Dr. Arnold asked him at some point, I wonder, I've been thinking a lot about gonorrheal transmission from mother to children. And sometimes what can happen is children can get gonorrhea in their eyes during the birthing process. He's like, I'd be really interested in, treating how we would treat gonorrhea in the eyes. And then Dr. Cutler, several months later, actually starts putting pus in a patient's eyes to see if it can be treated that way. So we know that at least Dr. Arnold had a lot of influence in bad ways. But on the other hand, Dr. Mahoney was writing Dr. Cutler, and he's the most senior, saying, I'm really not sure about these abrasion experiments because that's not how people get syphilis. And so, I don't think that we can base proof of the effectiveness of our post-exposure prophylaxis on abrasion experiments. And Dr. Cutler is ignoring that. So he was sort of picking and choosing his guidance. And what do you guys think about the renaming of the Perrin Award? I think in particular is pretty interesting. So that to me is, at least on a personal level, is something that's not as obvious as saying the Guatemala experiments were definitely horrible. The ASTDA, the American Sexual Transmitted Disease Association, actually put out an entire volume debating this topic. Some people who took the position that, Thomas Perrin did many wonderful things for sexually transmitted disease research, and he should be remembered for the good things. People who took the position, well, I won the Thomas Perrin Award, and I don't want to be associated with this type of thing. And also, Paul Lombardo, who's a professor down at GSU, who's one of our senior advisors, wrote his own piece reflecting his own views, saying that, well, I think that it's really important that we understand the flaws in our heroes. But the STDA decided eventually to take the name off and just call it their Achievement Award. And I'd be interested in any responses. What do you think, that was the right thing to do?
I was just thinking perhaps the award, Perrin's name could be attached to an award for recognizing the flaws in individuals in a positive way that we can learn from.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Right now, when I'm reviewing literature, I can see that some people, they designed experiments to produce the results that they want to get. And that was something that I can take away from this, because I'm not in working with human beings, machines. So I think that was really interesting. But I don't think that changing a name of some award can change the history or something that happened. This happened, and those people have been impacted with it. I don't know if U.S. government compensated anything or not to the people that have been injected with these diseases. Do you have any information on that?
Yeah, so the U.S. government did compensate some of the victims in the Tuskegee syphilis studies. HHS, after the commission released its report soon thereafter, committed roughly $1.8 million, 800,000 of which went down to Guatemala to help support preventative STD research and work that they're doing, including with HIV/AIDS, and $1 million of which was retained by CDC and NIH to really continue this evaluation of our human subjects research regulations to ensure that we're protecting participants currently as best we can.
So if I get it correctly, nothing specified to the persons that received the diseases, yeah?
No, not currently.
Please join me in thanking Kate for her talk.